In the spring of 1912, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of an old Jesuit villa outside Rome, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. The villa, known as Villa Mondragone, stood on a hill overlooking the ruins of ancient Tusculum, a place heavy with centuries of forgotten knowledge. Its corridors smelled faintly of parchment, candle wax, and history itself. Into this silence walked Wilfrid Michael Voynich, a Polish-born book dealer, antiquarian, and revolutionary-turned-scholar who had dedicated his life to rescuing rare manuscripts from obscurity. He had survived Tsarist prisons, exile, and political collapse, and now, in middle age, he sought something quieter but no less powerful: lost books. What he found that day would outlive every certainty he carried with him. Voynich had been invited to examine a private collection of manuscripts belonging to the Jesuit order. Many were routine: Latin theological treatises, Renaissance scientific texts, dusty volumes that had not been opened in decades. Then he reached a modest quarto-sized codex bound in limp vellum. Its cover was unremarkable. No title, no author, no date. But when Voynich opened it, something strange unfolded. Page after page revealed drawings unlike anything he had seen. Plants that did not exist in any botanical manual. Circular diagrams filled with stars, suns, and zodiac symbols. Nude female figures bathing in green liquid, connected by tubes and pools. Paragraphs of text written in an elegant, flowing script, but in no known language. The writing flowed left to right, its characters repeated with rhythm and consistency. It was not nonsense. It was structured, purposeful, and utterly unreadable. Voynich felt what every great discovery begins with: certainty without understanding. "This is something extraordinary," he reportedly told colleagues later. "It is not a forgery. It is too coherent for that, but it does not belong to any civilization we recognize." He bought it immediately. Tucked into the back of the volume was a folded letter dated August 19, 1666, written in Latin by Johannes Marcus Marci, a physician and rector at Charles University in Prague. The letter was addressed to Athanasius Kircher, one of the most famous scholars in Europe, a Jesuit polymath who claimed he had deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphs. Marci wrote, "This book was left to me by an intimate friend. I am told the author was Roger Bacon, the English Franciscan monk. It was bought by Emperor Rudolph II for 600 ducats. 600 ducats was a fortune, equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled artisan. If true, this meant the manuscript had once passed through the hands of Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, a ruler obsessed with alchemy, astrology, and secret knowledge. His court in Prague was a magnet for mystics, scientists, charlatans, and geniuses alike. And if it had once belonged to Rudolph, then the manuscript had likely been circulating in learned circles centuries before Voynich ever laid eyes on it. The book had history, but not a voice. Rudolph II ruled from 1576 to 1612, and unlike most emperors, he preferred laboratories to battlefields. He collected astronomical instruments, occult manuscripts, mechanical automata, and exotic curiosities. His court employed men like Tycho Brahe, the greatest observational astronomer of his age, and Johannes Kepler, who would later formulate the laws of planetary motion. Rudolph believed deeply in hidden knowledge. Alchemy to him was not superstition, it was a science in progress. Astrology was not fortune-telling, it was cosmic mathematics. He funded laboratories, workshops, and libraries dedicated to unlocking secrets no one else could see. So when Marci's letter claimed that Rudolph had purchased the mysterious manuscript, it did not sound implausible. What emperor obsessed with the unknown could resist a book written in an undeciphered script, filled with strange plants and cosmic diagrams? And yet, no record of such a purchase exists in Rudolph's meticulously kept inventories. The manuscript was already slipping between history's cracks. Voynich did not simply collect rare books. He hunted mysteries. Within weeks of acquiring the manuscript, he sent photographic copies of its pages to some of the world's most respected scholars, linguists, cryptographers, botanists, medieval historians. He believed deeply that it was encrypted, not a language lost to time, but a cipher waiting to be broken. The structure seemed promising. Words repeated in predictable patterns, lines aligned with botanical illustrations, consistent grammatical spacing. Voynich was convinced it concealed profound scientific or philosophical knowledge, perhaps from the Middle Ages, perhaps earlier. This is no hoax, he insisted. It has rules.
And rules mean meaning, but meaning refused to emerge. Those who examined the text noticed something unsettling. The script behaved like real language. Some words appeared only at the beginning of lines. Others clustered around specific illustrations. Certain characters rarely appeared together. Word lengths followed statistical distributions similar to natural languages. Yet no one could map the characters to known alphabets. No Latin, no Greek, no Arabic, no Hebrew, no cipher system familiar to Renaissance cryptography. It was not substitution, not transposition, not shorthand, not codebook, and most troubling of all, there were no corrections. Medieval manuscripts usually contain erasures, overwriting, marginal notes, evidence of human error. The Voynich manuscript showed almost none. Every page appeared clean, deliberate, confident, as though the author had never hesitated, as though the language were real.
The first section of the manuscript, now known as the botanical portion, contained drawings of plants. Some looked vaguely familiar: roots shaped like mandrakes, leaves resembling water lilies, flowers echoing daisies or thistles. But none matched real species exactly. Some plants had roots shaped like human figures, flowers with impossible geometries, leaves attached in biologically impossible ways. Botanists tried to identify them as stylized versions of known herbs. Others proposed they were imaginary plants used for alchemical symbolism. A few suggested they came from the New World, plants unknown to Europe before Columbus. But even those theories collapsed under scrutiny. These plants belonged nowhere. The manuscript's second major section showed circular diagrams filled with stars, suns, moons, and zodiac symbols. Aries, Taurus, Gemini, familiar figures appeared, but rendered in unfamiliar styles. Some diagrams resembled medieval cosmological charts. Others looked like astrological calendars. A few appeared to map something cyclic, perhaps time, perhaps the human body, perhaps seasons. In one section, the zodiac symbols were accompanied by rows of naked women holding stars, standing in tubs, or flowing through channels of green liquid. It was both anatomical and astronomical, and no one could explain why. The most unsettling pages were those showing dozens of nude female figures bathing in green pools, connected by elaborate pipe-like systems. The women appeared calm, sometimes smiling, sometimes gesturing toward the flow of liquid. Historians speculated, was this a medieval medical text about female anatomy? A symbolic depiction of bodily humors? An alchemical allegory for purification and transformation? In medieval medicine, the body was understood through fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Balance meant health. Imbalance meant disease. Some scholars wondered if these bathing women represented internal organs metaphorically, or perhaps processes of healing. But again, nothing could be proven. The manuscript refused to confess its purpose. Voynich's genius was not in decoding the manuscript. It was in convincing the world that it could be decoded. He presented it not as an artifact of the unknown, but as a puzzle, one that merely awaited the right mind. And minds came. By the 1920s, the manuscript had reached the desks of cryptographers trained in World War I intelligence, linguists fluent in dozens of ancient languages, historians specializing in medieval science. Some believed it was a ciphertext. Others suspected an artificial language. A few whispered about hoaxes, but no hoaxer, they argued, could sustain such internal statistical consistency across more than 200 pages. The book did not behave like nonsense.
It behaved like meaning wearing a mask. One of the first serious attempts to decode the manuscript came from William Romain Newbold, a philosopher and cryptographer at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1921, he announced triumphantly that he had broken the code. According to Newbold, the manuscript contained microscopic shorthand symbols embedded within the letters, visible only under magnification, which spelled out Latin text. He claimed the manuscript described advanced scientific discoveries, including spiral galaxies and biological cells, centuries before they were known. The press erupted. The Voynich Manuscript, Newbold claimed, was the work of Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar and early experimental scientist. Bacon, he argued, had encoded forbidden knowledge in microscopic script to avoid persecution. For a moment, the mystery seemed solved. Then it unraveled. Other scholars examined Newbold's methods and found that the microscopic letters were simply cracks in the ink, random imperfections interpreted through expectation. His translations relied on subjective rearrangement and speculative assumptions. Newbold had not cracked the code. He had projected meaning onto silence. By 1931, his solution was formally dismissed. The manuscript returned to darkness. Wilfrid Voynich never saw the manuscript decoded. He died in 1930, still convinced he had discovered one of history's greatest secrets. His wife, Ethel Voynich, a novelist and intellectual in her own right, kept the manuscript after his death. She too believed in its significance. When she died in 1960, the manuscript passed to a bookseller named Hans P. Krauss, who attempted unsuccessfully to sell it for years. No institution wanted a book no one could read. Finally, in 1969, Krauss donated it to Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, where it remains today as MS 408, locked in climate-controlled silence, still unread. By the mid-20th century, the Voynich manuscript had become more than a book. It had become a challenge, not just to cryptography, not just to linguistics, but to the assumption that every human artifact must be intelligible if only we try hard enough. What if this one was not meant to be read? What if it had already failed its audience centuries ago, and we were only inheriting its silence? Those who worked on the Voynich manuscript often reported the same sensation. The longer they studied it, the more it felt less like an object and more like an observer. It did not yield information. It absorbed attention. It did not answer questions. It multiplied them. The more you searched for meaning, the more meaning seemed to retreat, like a horizon that recedes with every step forward. By the end of the 1920s, the Voynich manuscript had achieved something rare. It had become famous without being understood. It had no story, only a reputation. And reputation, in the absence of explanation, breeds legend. Some called it the world's most mysterious book. Others called it the ultimate cipher. A few whispered darker possibilities, that it was meaningless by design, a deliberate artifact of confusion. But no one could prove anything, because the book had no language anyone could hear. In history, most mysteries begin with destruction. Burned libraries, lost archives, forgotten names. The Voynich manuscript began with survival. It survived when others vanished. It endured when languages died. It crossed centuries without explanation. And now, in a modern world that assumes everything can be decoded, it stood as a quiet rebuke. Some things resist. Some things remain. Some things refuse to speak. Rome, 1912. The city was thick with dust and echoes that summer. The dust of ancient roads, the echoes of empires long hallen. In a quiet Jesuit villa just outside the city, behind walls yellowed by centuries of sun and incense, a locked room was being opened for the first time in decades. Inside, stacked in crates and cabinets, lay thousands of old books, manuscripts, letters, remnants of suppressed monasteries, forgotten scholars, and vanished libraries. It was here
that Wilfrid Michael Voynich found the book that would steal his name.
Voynich was not a medievalist by training. He had been many things: revolutionary, exile, husband to a celebrated novelist, and, finally, a rare book dealer with a remarkable instinct for hidden treasures. Born in what is now Lithuania in 1865, he had once been a political radical in Tsarist Russia, imprisoned and exiled to Siberia before escaping and rebuilding his life in England. By the early 20th century, he was one of the most respected antiquarian booksellers in Europe, known for locating manuscripts others could not even dream of finding. In 1912, he had been invited to inspect part of a Jesuit collection being discreetly sold off. The Society of Jesus, under pressure to liquidate assets, had allowed certain trusted dealers access to repositories that had not been properly cataloged in centuries. Voynich entered one such room expecting theology, canon law, perhaps a few forgotten classical texts. Instead, he found a book that did not belong to any known world.
Voynich later described the moment with unusual restraint, but those who knew him sensed its impact immediately. Among the Latin treatises and parchment codices lay a small volume bound in limp vellum, unremarkable at first glance. But when he opened it, he saw writing, flowing, elegant, rhythmic, in no alphabet he recognized. There were no capitals, no punctuation, no corrections. The script looked deliberate, confident, practiced, as though written by someone fluent in a language no one else on earth now spoke. Even stranger were the illustrations. Plants that resembled no known species filled entire pages, leaves bending at impossible angles, roots spiraling like corkscrews, blossoms shaped like gears or flames. Other pages showed circular diagrams filled with stars, suns, moons, and strange concentric systems. Some sections depicted nude women bathing in pools connected by pipes and channels, as if inside a living machine. Voynich had handled thousands of medieval manuscripts. This was unlike any of them. He purchased the book along with several others, shipped it to London, and began what would become a lifelong obsession, discovering what this manuscript was and who had written it. Tucked inside the manuscript was a loose letter dated 1665 or 1666, written in Latin by a Prague physician named Johannes Marcus Marci to a Jesuit scholar in Rome, Athanasius Kircher. Marci's letter described the strange book and explained that it had once belonged to Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, who supposedly paid 600 ducats for it, a fortune, believing it to be the work of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English philosopher and experimentalist. Marci wrote, "I am sending you a book which was left to me by an intimate friend. The writing is unknown, the figures of plants unknown, and the stars unknown. I do not know what to think of it." He hoped Kircher, Europe's most famous cryptographer, might finally solve it. But Kircher never did, nor did anyone after him. This letter placed the manuscript in Prague by the early 17th century, in the orbit of one of Europe's most eccentric and intellectually adventurous courts. It also suggested something extraordinary, that this book had already baffled scholars for at least 250 years before Voynich ever touched it. The manuscript had a history, but its story was missing its first half. Voynich knew that mystery, carefully unveiled, could transform a book from curiosity into legend. But he was not sensationalist by nature. Instead, he approached the manuscript as a scholar-dealer hybrid. He transcribed samples, photographed pages, and quietly consulted linguists, cryptographers, and medievalists. No one recognized the language. No one recognized the plants. No one could identify the script. In 1915, Voynich finally presented the manuscript to the public scholarly world, displaying it at the Chicago Exhibition of Rare Books. He claimed, cautiously, that he believed it dated from the early 15th century and might indeed be connected to Roger Bacon, though he admitted there was no proof. The reaction was immediate. Some scholars were intrigued. Others were skeptical. A few were openly hostile, suspecting a hoax, perhaps even one perpetrated by Voynich himself to inflate the manuscript's value. But the material evidence argued otherwise. The vellum was real medieval parchment. The inks were consistent with historical composition. The handwriting was fluid, continuous, unhesitating, the work of someone writing naturally, not inventing symbols on the fly. The illustrations, while strange, followed medieval conventions of botanical and cosmological imagery. If it was a hoax, it was the most sophisticated medieval forgery ever created, and centuries ahead of its time. Voynich's life began to orbit this book. He wrote letters to cryptographers in England and America, to classicists, to botanists, to historians of medicine and astronomy. Each new expert saw something familiar and nothing recognizable. One linguist remarked that the text had statistical properties similar to real languages. Another noted that word patterns repeated in meaningful ways, yet no one could read even a single word. The manuscript was not gibberish. It was meaningful, but mute. The First World War brought a strange new audience to the Voynich Manuscript, military cryptographers. During the war, code-breaking had become an industrial science. Governments assembled teams of mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers to crack enemy communications. After the armistice, some of the world's finest cryptographic minds found themselves idle and intrigued by unsolved problems. Voynich saw opportunity. He sent copies of pages to American cryptographers, including those who had worked on German ciphers. Among them was William Friedman, who would later become the chief cryptologist of the U.S. Army and play a central role in breaking Japanese codes during World War II. Friedman became obsessed. Unlike many who approached the manuscript expecting trickery, Friedman believed it represented a real language or cipher, but one operating under rules unfamiliar to modern cryptography. He assembled a team, including linguists and mathematicians, who spent years analyzing letter frequencies, word patterns, positional behavior, and repetition structures. They discovered something astonishing. The manuscript followed linguistic laws. Certain symbols appeared only at the beginning of words. Others appeared only at the end. Some combinations occurred frequently, others never. There were repeated phrases that behaved like headings or captions. Words clustered by subject area, suggesting that sections of the manuscript discussed different topics. This was not random noise. Yet no substitution cipher, no transposition method, no known encryption system could unlock it. Friedman eventually concluded that the manuscript might be written in a natural language, encoded through a method no longer known, perhaps a cipher designed to preserve pronunciation but disguise meaning, or a system built on medieval shorthand traditions now lost. He admitted defeat, but not skepticism. "This is an intelligent text," he wrote privately, "not nonsense." As scholars studied the manuscript's structure, its internal organization became clearer. Though unreadable, its visual logic was undeniable. The book appeared to be divided into distinct sections. Herbal, pages filled with drawings of single plants, each labeled with blocks of text. Some plants resembled medieval herbals, but none matched known species. Astronomical/astrological, circular diagrams of stars, moons, suns, and zodiac signs, including familiar symbols like Aries, Taurus, and Gemini, but rendered in unfamiliar stylistic forms. Biological/anatomical, groups of nude women bathing in tubs, connected by pipes and channels, surrounded by flowing text. Some scholars saw representations of bodily systems, blood, digestion, reproduction. Others saw alchemy or cosmology. Cosmological, fold-out diagrams depicting rosettes, castles, towers, star systems, or perhaps maps, their meaning entirely unclear. Pharmaceutical, drawings of roots, jars, and vessels suggesting preparations of substances. Recipes/textual lists, dense paragraphs with star-shaped bullets or markers suggesting instructions or formulas. The manuscript did not appear to be fictional. It looked like a reference work, a manual, a compendium, a scientific or medical text from a world adjacent to our own. And yet, every word of it was sealed behind an invisible wall. The Marcy letter pointed to Emperor Rudolf II as an early owner. Rudolf ruled in Prague at the turn of the 17th century, and his court was infamous, or legendary, for its obsession with alchemy, astrology, natural magic, and hidden knowledge. Rudolf surrounded himself with astronomers, mystics, engineers, physicians, and charlatans alike. Johannes Kepler worked there. Tycho Brahe observed the heavens there. Alchemists claimed to transmute metals in hidden chambers beneath the castle. It was a court where strange books belonged. Several figures from Rudolf's circle have been proposed as possible authors or intermediaries. John Dee, the English mathematician, astrologer, and occult philosopher, who spent years in Rudolf's orbit and owned a vast library of manuscripts. Edward Kelly, Dee's associate, who claimed angelic communications and knowledge of secret languages. Jakub Horczycki de Tepenetz, Rudolf's personal physician and botanist, whose faint signature may appear on the manuscript's first page. None can be confirmed. Yet the manuscript fits perfectly into Rudolf's Prague, a place where astrology guided medicine, where botany blended with alchemy, where secret knowledge was currency, and where scholars believed nature itself was written in code. If the manuscript had been created in the 15th century, as Voynich suspected, it may have arrived in Prague centuries later, already old, already enigmatic, already unreadable. A relic without a key. Voynich never solved the manuscript. He spent the last years of his life trying, presenting theories, chasing connections, gathering expert opinions, but he died in 1930 without hearing a single word from its pages. After his death, the manuscript passed to his wife, Ethel Voynich, herself famous as the author of The Gadfly, a novel beloved by revolutionaries across Europe. When she died, the manuscript eventually moved through private hands before being purchased in 1969 by Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. There, it received its catalog name, MS 408. It also received something new, scientific scrutiny. In 2009, radiocarbon dating placed the parchment firmly between 1404 and 1438. This was decisive. The manuscript was not a Renaissance hoax. It was not an early modern invention. It belonged to the late medieval world, the era of illuminated herbals, medical compendia, astrological manuals, and experimental natural philosophy. The ink, the pigments, the style of illustration, all matched this period. Whatever it was real, and whoever wrote it seriously. By the mid-20th century, the Voynich manuscript had become something unprecedented, the world's most famous unreadable book. It was not famous because it was beautiful, though it was, not famous because it was ancient, though it was, but because it refused to speak. Thousands of scholars, amateurs, linguists, cryptographers, historians, mathematicians, and puzzle solvers have tried to unlock it. Some have claimed success, but none have convinced the academic community. Every proposed solution collapses under scrutiny, unable to translate more than a few words consistently, unable to generate meaningful grammar across the text, unable to explain its internal structures. And yet, the manuscript continues to behave like a real language. Word patterns recur, syntax seems consistent, sections differ in vocabulary. Some words appear near illustrations in suggestive ways. The text has rhythm, structure, order. It is meaningful, but the meaning is sealed, which raises a deeper question. What does it mean for a book to exist if no one can read it? Is it still knowledge? Is it still communication? Or is it something else? An artifact of thought without a voice, a mind speaking into the future without knowing whether anyone would ever understand.
The Voynich Manuscript is not silent because it says nothing. It is silent because we cannot hear. Wilfred Voynich once wrote that the manuscript seems to have been written by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. That remains its most haunting feature. The author, anonymous, invisible, wrote hundreds of pages in a coherent system, illustrated with careful attention, organized into meaningful categories, bound into a durable book, and preserved across centuries. Whoever they were, they believed their work would be read. They believed someone would understand. Yet 600 years later, we stand where Athanasius Kircher stood in Rome in 1666, holding a book we cannot enter. The Voynich Manuscript is not merely a puzzle. It is a confrontation with the limits of historical recovery.
A reminder that even in an age of archives, algorithms, and artificial intelligence, some voices remain locked behind doors for which the keys are lost, not hidden, not encrypted, but erased by time itself. And still, the pages wait. In the mid-20th century, the world learned how to make machines think, or at least imitate thought. Computers, born from wartime cryptography and Cold War anxiety, were no longer room-sized calculators alone. They were pattern hunters, language processors, statistical engines. And to those who had stared at the Voynich Manuscript for decades, they looked like salvation. If human intuition could not read the book, perhaps machines could. But what followed was not a solution, it was something stranger. The slow realization that the manuscript was not merely encrypted, it was operating on principles that resisted not just translation, but understanding itself.
And in that resistance, the Voynich Manuscript would become more than a medieval artifact. It would become a mirror, reflecting how humans think language works, and how often those assumptions fail. William Friedman never stopped thinking about the manuscript. After World War II, Friedman was no longer just a cryptologist. He was a legend. His team had broken the Japanese purple cipher, one of the most complex encryption systems of the war. He had helped invent modern cryptoanalysis. And yet, privately, he regarded the Voynich Manuscript as the one code he had never truly defeated. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Friedman assembled a final team, not to break enemy ciphers, but to crack the oldest unsolved code in the world. Among them were linguists, statisticians, psychologists, and cryptographers trained to see meaning inside chaos. They began with what cryptography had always begun with: frequency analysis. Certain symbols appeared more often than others. Certain words recurred in similar contexts. Some clusters seemed to behave like prefixes and suffixes. Friedman's team noticed that some symbols only occurred at the beginning of words, while others clustered at the end. Some words were long, some short. Some appeared only in certain sections. This was not random text. But when they tried to treat it like a substitution cipher, replacing symbols with letters, it failed. When they tried polyalphabetic ciphers, it failed. When they tried transposition systems, it failed. When they tried known medieval cryptographic methods, it failed. One cryptanalyst wrote in frustration, "The text behaves like language, but resists interpretation like noise." The contradiction haunted them. Eventually, Friedman came to a radical conclusion. The manuscript might not be encrypted in the traditional sense at all. Instead, it might be written in a constructed language, or an artificial system of encoding meaning, one that preserved grammatical structure but masked vocabulary through some lost method. In 1951, Friedman wrote what became one of the most important statements in Voynich history. The Voynich Manuscript is not a hoax. It is not meaningless. It is an attempt at communication, one whose system we do not yet understand. It was both an admission of defeat and a declaration of faith. By the 1970s and 1980s, a new kind of reader approached the manuscript, the computer scientist. If human scholars could not detect its rules, perhaps machines could.
Programs were written to analyze symbol distributions, word repetition patterns, entropy levels, and positional behavior across the text. The results were startling. Statistically, Voynich's, the manuscript's unknown script, behaved much more like natural language than like random noise or cipher output.
Its word frequencies followed Zipf's law, the mathematical distribution seen in real languages. Certain words clustered in topic-specific sections. There were positional regularities. Some symbols almost never appeared mid-word, others almost never appeared at the edges. And yet, it also differed from natural languages in critical ways. For instance, in most languages, word variation grows organically. Spelling shifts, grammatical inflections evolve, synonyms appear. In Voynich's, similar words often differed by only one character, suggesting mechanical generation or templated variation rather than organic linguistic drift. Example, sequences like Dane, Dain, Dair, Dain appeared in clusters, not randomly but systematically. To some researchers, this suggested a cipher system generating words through algorithmic rules.
To others, it suggested something stranger, a semantic language, where words were assembled modularly to encode meaning through structure rather than sound, like molecular chains of concept. To skeptics, it suggested nonsense masquerading as language. But nonsense rarely behaves so consistently. Every unsolved mystery invites its own undoing. If the manuscript could not be read, perhaps it was never meant to be. Some scholars proposed that the Voynich Manuscript was an elaborate medieval hoax, a book designed to look meaningful but actually contain gibberish, created to deceive wealthy patrons or mystify scholars. The fact that Emperor Rudolph II allegedly paid a fortune for it only strengthened the suspicion. But the hoax theory struggled with several problems. First, the manuscript's length, over 240 pages of continuous, coherent script, written without hesitation, corrections, or obvious randomness. Hoaxes tend to break down under such scale.
Second, its structure. The text changed vocabulary depending on section, as if discussing different subjects. The botanical pages used one lexicon, the astronomical pages used another, the recipe-like pages used yet another. Random nonsense rarely organizes itself this way. Third, its statistical behavior. Random or fabricated text usually shows either too much regularity or too much chaos. Voynich's showed neither. It occupied the narrow band where natural language lives, balanced between predictability and surprise. Fourth, the radiocarbon dating. The parchment dated firmly to the early 15th century. If it was a hoax, it was created centuries before modern cryptography, linguistics, or probability theory by someone who somehow anticipated how real language behaves mathematically. That would not be impossible, but it would be extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which the hoax theory has never produced. One of the manuscript's most puzzling features lies in its plants. Medieval herbals typically depict recognizable species: rosemary, sage, fennel, mandrake, often in stylized but identifiable forms. But the Voynich manuscript's plants are hybrids. Their leaves resemble one species, their roots another, their flowers none at all. Some resemble imaginary organisms, some resemble distorted real ones, some resemble nothing on Earth. Botanists have tried for decades to match them to known plants. A few tentative identifications have been proposed: sunflower, viola, water lily, but none withstand scrutiny across the entire illustration. Some scholars suggest the drawings are composites, symbolic representations of medicinal properties rather than literal botanical forms. Medieval medical theory often linked plants to bodily systems, astrological forces, and elemental qualities. A plant drawn with spiral roots and flame-like flowers might represent heat, circulation, or digestion rather than an actual species. Others argue the plants may come from a geographic region unfamiliar to European botanists, perhaps the New World or Asia, though the manuscript's dating predates most transoceanic botanical exchange.
Still others propose something more unsettling, that the plants are imaginary, conceptual diagrams of bodily systems, chemical processes, or cosmological forces disguised as flora.
But imagination alone cannot explain the consistency. The same drawing style, the same internal logic, the same compositional grammar appears throughout the manuscript. Whatever these plants are, they belong to a system, not fantasy. Perhaps the most haunting images in the manuscript appear in the so-called biological section. Here, nude women, dozens of them, are depicted bathing in pools, standing in tubs, floating in greenish liquids, or emerging from pipes and channels that interconnect across the page. Some appear pregnant, some hold objects, some gesture toward one another, others gaze outward, expressionless. The pipes resemble plumbing, but also veins, or intestines, or river systems, or alchemical apparatus, or something else entirely. Medieval medicine viewed the body not as a mechanical system, but as a fluid one, governed by humors, vapors, spirits, and balances of hot and cold. Water imagery was central to physiological thought. Baths were treatments. Fluids symbolize transformation. Some scholars interpret these pages as representations of female reproductive health, menstruation, conception, pregnancy, childbirth, encoded in symbolic language rather than anatomical realism. Others see alchemical processes, purification, dissolution, transformation, staged through bodies instead of chemicals. Others see cosmology, the movement of stars and forces represented metaphorically as flowing water and vessels. What is striking is the absence of shame. The women are nude, but not eroticized. They are functional, symbolic, serene. Their nudity is clinical, ritualistic, schematic, as if the human body itself is a diagram of some deeper system. And once again, the text surrounding them remains unreadable. Meaning is present, but it is sealed. One of the deepest challenges of the Voynich Manuscript lies in this. We do not even know what kind of language it is. Is it phonetic, representing sounds? Is it logographic, representing ideas? Is it syllabic? Is it shorthand? Is it cipher? Is it constructed? Is it natural? Most medieval scripts map to known linguistic families: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, or vernacular tongues written in modified alphabets. But Voynich's maps to nothing. Its characters do not resemble Latin, Greek, Arabic, or Hebrew, nor do they resemble known medieval shorthand systems, alchemical symbols, or cipher alphabets. They are internally consistent, aesthetically balanced, and written fluidly, as if the scribe had learned them from childhood. This suggests something radical, that the manuscript may be written in a private script invented by its author or community, not as a cipher to hide known language, but as a language system in its own right. If true, this places the Voynich manuscript in a rare category, an isolated written tradition, severed from linguistic ancestry, surviving without its speakers, without its culture, without its key, a fossil of thought. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, attempts to translate the Voynich manuscript accelerated and diversified. Some researchers claimed it was medieval Hebrew. Others said it was Latin written through anagrammatic substitution. Others said it was Turkish, Aztec Nahual, Chinese, Arabic, or Proto-Romance. Some claimed it was shorthand Latin. Others claimed it was glossolalia, meaningless language-like sound patterns. Some proposed that it encoded secret knowledge of Cathars, Templars, heretics, or alchemists. Others argued it was a pharmacological manual from Mexico. Others said it was a Renaissance art project. Others said it was deliberate nonsense. Nearly all these theories shared one fatal flaw. They could translate only selectively. A handful of words, a few phrases, never the whole text, never consistently, never with grammar that worked across sections, never with translations that matched the illustrations. Language does not behave that way.
If a theory explains only what it chooses to see and fails everywhere else, it is not a solution, it is projection. And the Voynich Manuscript resists projection more stubbornly than any text in history. Something peculiar happens to people who spend years studying the Voynich Manuscript. They become different, more cautious, more obsessive, more speculative, more philosophical. Many begin convinced they will solve it, that the problem is merely technical, waiting for the right algorithm or insight. But after years of failure, they begin to question not just their methods, but their assumptions about language itself. What if language does not always encode sound? What if writing can represent ideas directly, bypassing speech? What if the manuscript's author intended it to be read by only one person or one community, using shared conventions now extinct? What if meaning does not survive translation? What if some knowledge is structurally unportable?
These are not cryptographic questions. They are epistemological ones. The Voynich Manuscript becomes, for many, less a puzzle to solve and more a boundary marker, a place where human understanding collides with historical loss. Every encrypted message has an intended reader. Every secret code presupposes someone who can break it or already knows the key. But who was the Voynich Manuscript written for? No marginal notes appear in its pages, no glosses, no corrections, no ownership marks, no annotations explaining difficult words. Medieval readers almost always scribbled in their books. This one remained untouched. No companion volume survives explaining its system. No reference to its language appears in known texts. No evidence suggests it was ever successfully read, not even by those who owned it. This raises a chilling possibility. What if the manuscript's author was the only person who could read it? What if the system died with them? What if the book was not encrypted to hide knowledge, but written in a language that never escaped its origin point? A language without descendants, a voice without heirs. If so, the Voynich Manuscript is not merely unreadable, it is untranslatable. And that distinction matters. Unreadable means we lack the key. Untranslatable means the key no longer exists. Despite all this, the manuscript continues to invite interpretation, not because we understand it, but because it feels meaningful. The plants feel intentional. The diagrams feel structured. The text feels ordered. The illustrations feel purposeful. The book feels coherent. This coherence is its power and its curse. It promises meaning while denying access. It stands like a locked door in a familiar hallway, in a house we thought we knew. And yet, in its refusal, the Voynich Manuscript does something rare. It reminds us that the past is not fully recoverable. That knowledge can vanish, not just through destruction, but through isolation. That writing, humanity's greatest weapon against oblivion, can fail. That even when ink survives and parchment endures, meaning can still die. In the 21st century, artificial intelligence entered the hunt. Machine learning systems were trained on the manuscript's text, clustering words, predicting symbol sequences, analyzing contextual embeddings, searching for latent grammatical structures. Some models suggested the text might be algorithmically generated. Others suggested it behaved like encoded Romance language. Others suggested it behaved like no known language at all. No consensus emerged. What emerged instead was something more sobering. Even machines built to detect patterns struggled to detect meaning. This did not make the manuscript less mysterious. It made it more human. The Voynich Manuscript is often described as a code, but codes are meant to be broken. This book feels different. It feels like a conversation interrupted, not encrypted, but orphaned. A voice speaking in a language that no one else remembers how to hear. It is not silent. We are deaf. Somewhere between 1404 and 1438, in a room lit by candlelight,
Someone sat down with fresh vellum and began to write. They did not hesitate. They did not scratch out words or correct letters. Their hand moved smoothly, confidently, as if copying from a text already fully formed in their mind. Page after page, they filled parchment with unfamiliar characters, elegant and repetitive, flowing in a script no one else would ever recognize. Alongside the text, they painted plants that did not grow, stars that did not match known constellations, and women bathing in impossible systems of pipes and pools. They believed, or at least acted as if, someone would one day read this. But 6 centuries later, we still do not know who they were.
The Voynich Manuscript is unique, not merely because it is unreadable, but because it is unclaimed. Most medieval books carry fingerprints of identity, colophons naming scribes, marginal notes revealing owners, library stamps, references and inventories. This manuscript carries none. It enters history suddenly, already mysterious, already silent, already severed from its origin. To understand the Voynich manuscript, we must do something historians are trained to resist. We must reason backward from absence. The radiocarbon dating of the parchment in 2009 settled a crucial question. The manuscript's vellum was prepared between 1404 and 1438, placing it squarely in the early 15th century, the late medieval world, not the Renaissance, not the early modern age of cryptography, not the era of printing presses and experimental science. This matters because it frames what kind of person could have created it. In the early 1400s, Europe was a world of monasteries, universities, medical schools, astrologers, herbalists, and natural philosophers. Knowledge circulated slowly, often privately, copied by hand, guarded by guilds, cloisters, and courts. Medical practice was rooted in humoral theory, astrology guided diagnosis, botany blended with magic. Alchemy was not chemistry yet, but it was not fantasy either. It was experimental natural philosophy expressed in symbolic language.
Books in this period were often written not for the public, but for small circles, students, apprentices, patrons, or private scholars. The Voynich manuscript fits this world. Its illustrations resemble herbals, medical diagrams, astrological charts, and alchemical vessels, but none precisely. It looks like a medical, natural philosophical compendium, but one operating under a private symbolic system. And its text is not encrypted Latin or Greek. It is something else. Paleographers, scholars who study handwriting, have examined the manuscript closely. Their conclusions are surprisingly consistent. The text appears to be written by one primary scribe, possibly 2 at most. The handwriting is fluid and practiced, suggesting the writer was deeply familiar with the script, not inventing it as they went. The letter forms are consistent across hundreds of pages. There is little variation, little hesitation, little correction. This is not experimental writing. This is fluent writing.
Which implies something radical. The author did not invent the script in isolation while writing the book. They already knew it. They were already literate in it. Which raises the question, who else was? There is no evidence of this script appearing anywhere else in medieval Europe. No inscriptions, no marginal notes, no fragments, no companion texts. If this was a language, it was a private one. If this was a cipher, it was one of extraordinary complexity and consistency, far beyond what was known in 15th century cryptographic practice. Either way, the manuscript suggests not a lone madman scribbling nonsense, but someone working within a system, whether linguistic, symbolic, or conceptual, that had internal coherence and durability. They wrote hundreds of pages. They expected continuity. They expected understanding. Every book has a reason to exist. Some teach, some persuade, some record, some preserve, some conceal. The Voynich manuscript appears to belong to the category of technical manuals, books meant to instruct or document rather than entertain.
Its structure resembles medieval reference works: sections, headings, diagrams, labels, recipe-like paragraphs, and visual correspondences between image and text. But what kind of manual? The botanical pages resemble herbals, medieval guides to medicinal plants, but the plants are unidentifiable. The biological pages resemble anatomical or physiological diagrams, but the bodies are symbolic rather than realistic. The cosmological pages resemble star charts or astrological diagrams, but they do not match known celestial models. The pharmaceutical pages resemble apothecary instructions, but the ingredients are unreadable. The manuscript feels like a book of knowledge, but knowledge encoded through a system not meant for outsiders.
Which suggests a possibility historians find uncomfortable, that the manuscript was written for a closed audience, perhaps a guild, an order, a school, or even a single patron, using a private symbolic language. Medieval medicine, astrology, and alchemy were not public sciences. They were often guarded, hierarchical, and initiatory. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship, symbolism, allegory, and coded imagery. In some traditions, secrecy was not incidental, it was essential. Knowledge, they believed, lost power if exposed to the unworthy. The Voynich Manuscript may belong to this world, not a cipher to hide information from enemies, but a system to preserve knowledge within a close circle, a book that assumes its reader already knows how to read it. From the moment Wilfrid Voynich revealed the manuscript in 1912, one name clung to it like a ghost: Roger Bacon. Bacon was a 13th century English Franciscan friar, philosopher, mathematician, and experimentalist, a figure sometimes mythologized as a precursor to modern science. He wrote about optics, chemistry, astronomy, languages, and cryptography. He advocated for empirical observations centuries before it became mainstream, and he believed that secret knowledge should sometimes be concealed from the unprepared. According to the letter found with the manuscript, Emperor Rudolph II had been told the book was written by Bacon and paid an enormous sum for it. But the radiocargon dating makes this impossible. Bacon died in 1292. The manuscript's parchment dates to the early 1400s. The script, imagery, and materials are incompatible with Bacon's era. Still, the Bacon myth reveals something important. Early modern readers believed the manuscript belonged to the world of experimental knowledge and secret science. They did not think it was a novel. They did not think it was art. They thought it was knowledge, strange, hidden, powerful, and that perception may not have been wrong. The first confirmed historical appearance of the manuscript is in Prague, in the early 17th century, in the orbit of Emperor Rudolph II. Rudolph's court was unlike any other in Europe. He ruled not through war or diplomacy, but through curiosity. His palace was filled with astronomers, astrologers, alchemists, engineers, physicians, mathematicians, artists, and mystics. Johannes Kepler calculated planetary orbits there. Tycho Brahe mapped the stars there. Alchemists promised transmutation in secret laboratories beneath the castle. Collectors amassed mechanical automata, exotic animals, magical artifacts, and forbidden books. Rudolph believed the universe was a coded system, that nature itself was written in symbols waiting to be deciphered. To such a mind, the Voynich manuscript would have seemed not bizarre, but irresistible. Among Rudolph's circle were figures whose lives brush the manuscript's shadows. Jakob Horczycki de Tepenitz, the emperor's personal physician and botanist, whose faint signature may appear on the manuscript's first page. John Dee, the English mathematician, astrologer, and occult philosopher, who spent years in Rudolph's orbit and claimed to communicate with angels through an invented language. Edward Kelly, Dee's associate, who claimed alchemical secrets and also used mysterious scripts and symbols. None can be proven authors, but they reveal the kind of world in which such a manuscript made sense, a world where knowledge was encoded, symbolic, and private, where language itself was malleable, where diagrams, stars, plants, and bodies all belonged to a unified cosmic system. Yet none of these figures lived in the early 15th century.
They merely inherited the manuscript. The question remains, who created it?
One of the most intriguing and controversial hypotheses about the Voynich manuscript concerns its imagery of women. Unlike most medieval scientific texts, which depict male bodies or abstract symbols, the Voynich manuscript features women prominently: nude women, bathing women, pregnant women, women interacting with fluid systems, women inhabiting diagrams. Some scholars have suggested that the manuscript may have been created for or by women, perhaps midwives, healers, or practitioners of reproductive medicine, whose knowledge was transmitted orally and privately rather than through official male-dominated institutions. In medieval Europe, women often served as healers, herbalists, and midwives, especially in rural communities. They possessed deep knowledge of plants, reproduction, menstruation, childbirth, and bodily rhythms, knowledge often marginalized, stigmatized, or persecuted as unscientific or even heretical.
Could the Voynich manuscript encode a female-centered medical tradition? The idea is seductive, but evidence is thin. No medieval woman is known to have written in a private script. No documentation links the manuscript to midwifery traditions. The imagery, while centered on female bodies, is highly symbolic rather than anatomical. The astronomical and cosmological sections suggest a broader intellectual framework than reproductive medicine alone. Still, the manuscript's unusual focus on women, not as objects of desire, but as functional participants in symbolic systems, sets it apart from most medieval scientific texts. It suggests that whoever wrote it thought differently about bodies, knowledge, and representation. Many researchers see alchemy everywhere in the Voynich manuscript, not that caricature of turning lead into gold, but the medieval discipline of transformation, in which physical substances mirrored spiritual processes and material change symbolized cosmic order.
Alchemical texts were notoriously symbolic, filled with coded language, allegory, strange creatures, mythic imagery, and deliberately obscure diagrams. Authors often concealed their knowledge behind private symbol systems, believing that uninitiated readers would misunderstand or misuse it. The Voynich manuscript's imagery, vessels, baths, flows, cycles, transformations, roots, stars, and human figures, fits alchemical visual language remarkably well. Its botanical pages may represent not plants, but stages of processes. Its bathing women may represent purification. Its pipes may represent circulation. Its stars may represent cosmic influences. Its recipes may represent operations rather than substances. Yet, alchemical texts almost always contain recognizable symbols: suns, moons, lions, dragons, kings, queens, sulfur, mercury, salt. The Voynich manuscript contains none of these explicitly. It feels alchemical, but in a language we do not recognize, which suggests either a private alchemical tradition or something adjacent but distinct. Perhaps the most radical hypothesis is also the simplest. What if the Voynich manuscript is not encrypted at all? What if it is written in a natural language, one that no longer exists? Languages die all the time. Dialects vanish.
Writing systems disappear. Entire linguistic traditions vanish without trace when communities collapse, migrate, assimilate, or are destroyed. But even extinct languages usually leave echoes: inscriptions, loanwords, fragments, references, descendant scripts. The Voynich manuscript leaves none. Still, imagine a small intellectual community, monastic, medical, mystical, or scholarly, developing a private written language, used only internally, never spreading, and dying out within a generation or two. Their books might survive, their language might not. In that case, the manuscript is not encrypted. It is orphaned. We are not missing a key. We are missing a culture. And that absence may be irreversible. What strikes historians most when they examine the Voynich manuscript closely is not its strangeness, but its discipline. The text is structured. The sections are coherent. The illustrations follow internal logic.
The script is consistent. The layouts are intentional.
This is not madness. This is not whimsy. This is not random. This is the work of someone methodical, patient, trained, and purposeful. They were not playing. They were working, and they believed what they were writing mattered. That belief itself, preserved in ink and vellum, is one of the manuscript's most powerful features. Someone cared enough to spend years creating a book no one else could read. Someone believed that knowledge was worth preserving, even if it remained hidden. Someone believed that meaning could survive beyond their lifetime, even if their language could not. Most medieval books connect us to communities, monasteries, universities, courts, libraries. The Voynich Manuscript connects us to none. It is a book without a home, without a lineage, without a tradition, without a language family, without a known author, without a known reader, without a known purpose. And yet, it exists, intact, coherent, deliberate, as if dropped into history from a parallel intellectual universe. This isolation is what makes it haunting. Not that it is unreadable, but that it is alone. Whoever wrote the Voynich Manuscript possessed several qualities. They were literate and educated. They were skilled in drawing and diagramming. They understood botanical, medical, and cosmological traditions. They worked methodically and patiently. They operated within a symbolic system unfamiliar to us. They believed in the durability of their work. They believed in a reader. They were not a trickster. They were not a fantasist. They were not a forger. They were not writing for spectacle. They were writing for knowledge. And that knowledge, whatever it was, mattered enough to be written in a language that protected it, or perhaps simply belonged to it. Every unsolved mystery carries the hope of resolution. But some mysteries carry something else, the possibility that resolution may not exist. If the Voynich Manuscript was written in a private symbolic language that never escaped its community, then no amount of cryptography will unlock it. No algorithm will translate it. No database will match it. No archive will explain it. It will remain exactly what it is now, a book with meaning, without access, not because it is hidden, but because it is alone. In the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, sunlight filters through marble walls so thin they glow. The room is quiet in a way that feels intentional, as if sound itself has been disciplined into reverence. At the center, beneath glass, rests a book few visitors recognize, and fewer still understand. MS-408, the Voynich Manuscript. It lies open to a page of green pools and pale women bathing in impossible vessels, or perhaps to a page of plants that have never grown anywhere, or perhaps to a star chart that does not match the sky. Visitors lean closer, searching instinctively for words they might recognize, Latin, Greek, anything, and find nothing. And yet, they do not walk away. They stay. They stare. They feel, without knowing why, that something is being withheld, not deliberately, not cruelly, but structurally, as if the book is not refusing them, as if it simply does not know how to speak to them. Which leads us to the most unsettling possibility of all. What if the Voynich Manuscript is not unreadable because we lack the key, but because we are not the intended readers? Most codes are designed to exclude. A cipher assumes two groups, those who can read and those who cannot. Encryption is hostile. It withholds meaning intentionally, guarding knowledge from enemies, rivals, or the uninitiated. But the Voynich Manuscript feels different. There is no sign of urgency, no evidence of paranoia, no marks of compression or abbreviation, no shortcuts, no distortions designed to maximize concealment. The script flows naturally. The words are long. The sentences stretch. The layout is spacious. The illustrations are careful and generous. This is not the language of fear. It is the language of confidence. Whoever wrote this book did not seem worried about enemies intercepting it. They did not use complex cryptographic systems known from medieval diplomacy or military correspondence. They did not encode in layers or use nulls or homophones or shifting alphabets. They wrote freely, which suggests that the book was not meant to hide knowledge from outsiders. It was meant to preserve knowledge for insiders. There is a difference. One is secrecy. The other is community.
If the Voynich Manuscript was written in a private language, it may not have been secret in the sense of forbidden, only unfamiliar, a closed system, not an encrypted one, a dialect without neighbors, a grammar without descendants. In that case, the tragedy of the manuscript is not concealment, it is extinction. History is full of languages we cannot read. Linear A, written on Bronze Age Crete, remains undeciphered. The Indus Valley script has resisted all translation. Rongorongo, the glyphs of Easter Island, vanished with the collapse of its culture. Even Etruscan hieroglyphs were unreadable for over a millennium, until the Rosetta Stone bridged the gap. But in each of those cases, there was hope. Inscriptions, bilingual texts, archaeological context, linguistic descendants. The Voynich Manuscript has none. No inscriptions elsewhere, no bilingual companion, no references, no fragments, no descendants. It exists in isolation, a single artifact from a vanished system.
This makes it unique. It is not merely an undeciphered text, it is an orphaned language. And orphaned languages do not resist translation because they are difficult. They resist translation because they have nothing left to connect to. Most books are vessels for content, but some objects, religious icons, ritual artifacts, symbolic diagrams, function not primarily as messages, but as presences. They are not read, they are contemplated, they are used, they are engaged with. What if the Voynich Manuscript belongs in part to this category? Its images are not explanatory, they are symbolic. Its diagrams are not instructional, they are evocative. Its women are not anatomical, they are archetypal. Its plants are not botanical, they are conceptual. It does not describe reality, it models it.
Medieval thought often approached knowledge not through description, but through correspondence, the belief that all things mirrored one another across scales, body and cosmos, plant and planet, earth and heaven, microcosm and macrocosm. Diagrams were not illustrations of things, but maps of relationships. In that tradition, a manuscript could function as a cosmic schema, not meant to be read linearly, but contemplated as a system. The Voynich Manuscript may not be a book to read. It may be a book to inhabit. Somewhere in the early 15th century, someone could read this manuscript, not haltingly, not approximately, fluently. They could glance at its symbols and understand them. They could move through its diagrams and follow their logic. They could trace the lines between plant, star, body, and vessel and see meaning unfold. They might have used the manuscript practically, as a medical reference, a pharmacological guide, an astrological calendar, or a symbolic cosmology. Or they might have used it ritually, as a meditative object, a teaching tool, a map of transformation. We do not know. But we know they existed, because no one writes a 240-page book in a language no one else understands. That would be madness. This was communication, which means there was once a community, however small, in which the manuscript was readable. And that community is gone. Not hidden, gone. The Voynich Manuscript unsettles us, not simply because it resists interpretation, but because it challenges our assumptions about knowledge itself.
We like to believe that information, once written, can always be recovered. We believe archives save truth.
We believe preservation equals survival. But the Voynich Manuscript exposes a deeper vulnerability. Meaning does not survive unless its context survives. Language does not survive unless its community survives. Symbols do not survive unless their conventions survive. Ink and parchment can last 6 centuries. Meaning can vanish in 1 generation. This is the manuscript's real lesson. Not mystery, mortality. This is why hoax theories persist. If the manuscript is a hoax, then nothing has been lost. There was no language, no knowledge, no community, only deception. The silence is artificial, not tragic. The mystery is fake, not real. The problem is technical, not existential. But if the manuscript is genuine, and all material evidence suggests it is, then something far more disturbing has happened. A knowledge system existed. It mattered. It was recorded. And yet it vanished so completely that even its language left no trace. The manuscript is not evidence of deception.
It is evidence of fragility. We often treat unreadability as absence, but unreadability is not emptiness. It is density. It is compression. It is meaning without access. The Voynich Manuscript is full, not hollow. Its pages are crowded with intention, structure, system, and coherence. It is not noise. It is not chaos. It is not randomness. It is something that once made sense to someone, which means the manuscript still has meaning. It simply does not have translation. And those two things are not the same. Every book assumes a reader. The Voynich Manuscript assumed one too. But we are not that reader. We are not part of its linguistic community. We are not trained in its symbolic system. We do not inhabit its intellectual world. And so we encounter not a puzzle to solve, but a boundary, the edge of historical empathy. We can analyze its structure. We can measure its symbols. We can date its parchment. We can contextualize its imagery. We can reconstruct its circulation. But we cannot cross the threshold into its meaning. Not because it is locked, but because the door no longer exists. And yet, people continue. Cryptographers, linguists, historians, programmers, amateurs, artists, mystics, obsessives. Why? Because the Voynich Manuscript promises something we cannot stop wanting: access, connection, recovery. It tempts us with the possibility that no knowledge is truly lost, only misplaced. That every system can be decoded. That every voice can be heard again. That every silence can be made to speak. It is the ultimate puzzle not because it is difficult, but because it resists closure. In the end, the Voynich Manuscript may tell us more about ourselves than about its author. It exposes our faith in interpretation, our belief in progress, our assumption that meaning is portable, our discomfort with irrecoverable loss. It stands as a reminder that human knowledge is not cumulative by default. It is fragile. It is discontinuous. It is vulnerable to extinction. The manuscript is not a message from the past. It is a wound in the archive. When asked what the Voynich Manuscript means, the most honest answer is this: we do not know. Not because we are ignorant, but because the conditions that would allow us to know no longer exist. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is a boundary of history. Most books outlive their authors. Few outlive their readers. The Voynich Manuscript did both. It survived the hand that wrote it. It survived the community that read it. It survived the language that shaped it. It survived the world that made it intelligible. What remains is a book without a voice, not because it has nothing to say, but because it no longer has anyone to say it to. Which makes it perhaps the loneliest object in intellectual history.
Imagine standing in a ruined city whose people, language, culture, and memory are gone, and finding a single intact library book, written in a script no one else recognizes.
The building has collapsed. The streets are dust. The names are lost. But the book remains. The Voynich Manuscript is that book. Not a riddle, a survivor.